Thanks again to Duncan Trussell. We have a link to his family hour. If you want to check out some of the interviews he's done, we've got it on the Coast to Coast website. We're all lost in time and space, in a sense. Here we are, hurtling through the inky darkness of space, the vastness of the universe, strapped atop this tiny blue orb, the only home to intelligent life in the vastness of the universe, or so we think. Are there other intelligences out there, perhaps visiting us from time to time? Are we also surrounded by an ocean of spirit forms, the life force or consciousness of long ago humans, waiting to be recycled in one form or another? As a young man, Jeffrey Mishlove had a profound experience, one that could be considered paranormal. It was a dream visit from a distant relative, a relative who died that same day. Was it just a dream, though? Dr. Mishlove didn't take it that way, and that experience sort of helped set him on the path that is now known all over the world. He is a Ph.D. who has the distinction of being the only person in the world to have earned a doctoral diploma in parapsychology from the accredited University of California, Berkeley, that back in 1980. He teaches parapsychology for ministers in training with the Center for Spiritual Living. His video interviews posted online under the title New Thinking Aloud include give and take conversations with the best minds in the world, parapsychologists, academics, researchers interested in consciousness, the paranormal, life after death, communication with the other side, psychic phenomena, and a lot more. 8 months ago, Dr. Mishlove won the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies BICS Grand Prize, its essay contest, asking for the best evidence for survival of human consciousness after physical death. This coming week, he'll be one of the authorities gathering in Utah for the IONS conference to carry on and expand consciousness work, looks at near-death experiences. He's delivering the keynote address, and in just a moment, he joins us for a wide-ranging conversation. We'll be right back. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Mishlove back to Coast. Jeff, great to have you here.
Pleasure to be with you.
I haven't talked to you since the Bigelow contest, the BICS contest essay award was handed out back in December. First prize is $500,000. Now, that's the kind of thing that can get the attention of the field. You're not a wealthy man. Can you tell me, did it change your life at all?
Well, I'll tell you what I did. I bought a telescope. So I'm spending my evenings now looking at the stars and renewing my interest in astronomy. That's one of the benefits of having a little extra cash.
Excellent. Mr. Bigelow had talked to me and others about his idea for that contest, what he really hoped to do, which was to stimulate the NDE consciousness research community, wherever it might be, to find out if there are pockets of research around the planet and to get them to come out of the closet, so to speak, and to share their work with the world. Did that work, do you think?
I think it's had a big impact on the field, and it's an ongoing impact, as a matter of fact, because the Bigelow Institute has more plans for the future. In fact, some of those plans will be announced at the upcoming conference you mentioned for the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And
you're delivering the keynote at that event?
That's right.
And is it going to be based on your paper from last year?
It will be. Of course, the paper ran 25,000 words, which is much more than you can put into a 1-hour keynote, but I'm actually doing 3 different presentations at that event, so I hope to cover quite a bit of material.
I read your paper, of course, and I've also since read a couple of the responses. I thought the UFO world was pretty nasty, but some of this stuff it was very pointed. Did you expect the kind of pushback that you got from some of your colleagues in this field?
This has been, I hate to say it, but something of a ghetto science, because it's a small, underfunded area. It exists on the margins of society, and there's always been, like any other ghetto, there's been a lot of criticism, and actually I think that the amount of criticism that's come in on this juncture of my life is much less than when I received my doctoral degree in parapsychology 40 years ago. I mean, back then there was a huge effort launched by the scoffers to try and get the university to withdraw the degree completely. And so the criticism that's come in so far has been relatively mild as far as I'm concerned.
As you mentioned, you said it's been underfunded, and of course it has. It's considered a fringe science. You look at it, the kinds of research that you're pursuing, the kinds of theories that have developed, and it would seem like we're talking about phenomena, conditions that are central to the human existence, not something that is a fringe, but central to who we are and why we're here. You could make that argument, couldn't you?
I totally agree with you. I think it's a terrible shame that mainstream culture treats this as a non-existent field whatsoever. If you go to most colleges or scientific establishments, they act as if there is no evidence for life after death, where in fact we have 150 years of evidence, an enormous body of evidence.
I saw some of the criticism, a paper that I think has been published in the IANS Journal or the JRE Journal, and it basically said, well, gosh, Dr. Mishlove didn't include all the contrary arguments, which seemed to me just a dumb criticism because your assignment for the essay was give us the best evidence in favor of this hypothesis that the consciousness survives physical death, not to disprove it, right? It just seemed to me...
If Mr. Bigelow had asked for an essay to prove that there is no life after death, I would have written a very different essay. I think the ones that some of those critics would have liked to have read.
For the benefit of our listeners, can you give us the highlights, not all 25,000 words worth, but the central arguments that you make in that paper and that you'll be advancing at the IANS conference? So what is the best evidence that we go on, that some part of us goes on?
Yeah, I think the central argument is that there are multiple lines of evidence all pointing in this direction, so you don't have to depend on research. You don't have to depend upon the reincarnation research. You don't have to depend on work with mediums. You don't have to depend on spontaneous experiences that people have in dreams or the experiences that people have who are using electronic communication to communicate with the dead. None of those individual areas is sufficient by itself. I mean, a good critic can attack each and every one of them, but when you take them all together, the evidence is just overwhelming. You can't deny the existence once you look at the wide range of evidence all pointing in the same direction.
I think, Jeffrey, you and I, when we had our conversation there at that BICS event last December, I expressed to you sort of what's harbored in the back of my head is that when I consider these topics, I always stop and ask, is it wishful thinking on my part? Do we just wish that this evidence proves that we go on, a part of us doesn't die, and we're a sort of eternal beings to some degree, because no one, or at least very few of us, want to die. We want to think that the light goes out and that's it.
I hear from people who say that's exactly what they want. They don't want to survive. Their life is so unhappy that all they want is oblivion. They would be very happy to just have the lights go out. But I do agree with you that any thoughtful person wants to protect themselves against self-delusion and against believing it's true simply because we want it to be true.
I'll tell you what is persuasive to me in the whole panoply of evidence and arguments that you've raised. That two things stand out. One is in these near-death experiences that have been really well documented all over the world, dating back centuries throughout human history, that people are dead. Their brain is dead, but they are not. There's a form of them. There's a consciousness that continues. Can you talk about that a bit, how solid the evidence is? Any cases that come to mind that really are persuasive to you?
Well, The funny thing about the near-death experience is that traditionally speaking, it is true. The brain is dead in the sense there's no electrical activity going on in the brain. So conventionally, people think there shouldn't be any conscious activity if there's no electrical activity. But I will say, since I wrote the essay, there's new research coming out that suggests that even though electrical activity in the brain has stopped, it doesn't mean the neurons are actually dead and can't be revived. That it appears as if the neurons might linger for an hour or two after electrical activity stops. So I do think that the field is in flux, and what we call physical death may vary from time to time, and that's why near-death experience, as important as it is not necessarily conclusive evidence for life after death. It certainly points in that direction, and the way I view it, George, is that the reports coming from near-death experience almost certainly are depictions of what I would call the early stages of the afterlife.
The other part of it, the argument that's been made by you and others, I think I'm thinking back to Leslie Kane's Surviving Death series that she did for television, are these reincarnation cases where little kids remember past life memories. And then in some specific cases, they've been able to document it, that they've found the paper trail, the evidence trail that shows that their memories of those other lives were accurate. Can you share with us your thoughts on that kind of research and whether there are any of those cases that jump out at you that you recall the details about?
Well, at the University of Virginia, the Department of Perceptual Studies, they have a database of, last I heard, 2,700 cases of young children who begin describing their past lives virtually as soon as they can begin to speak at 2 years of age. And approximately 1,700 of those cases are ones in which the descriptions provided by the children were sufficient to enable researchers to actually identify the previous person. We call those solved cases. So you've got 1,700 solved reincarnation cases. It doesn't mean that everybody reincarnates, but we have good evidence that at least some 1,700 people have, which I think, from a scientific point of view, is extremely strong. And what fascinates me about these cases is that very often the cases are accompanied by dreams. The parents will have dreams beforehand. This is particularly true in Burma, where it seems to be a tradition that reincarnation cases are preceded by what are known as announcing dreams. And there is an interesting case that I wrote about in my essay. A Burmese village headman named U Ba Kyar there was a revolt. There were what would you call them?
An uprising
soldiers.
Or something? Yeah.
Yeah, there was fighting going on, and there was a lot of conflict, and soldiers came and killed the village headman, and very brutally. Now, he had some close friends when he was alive. The Ong family and the wife had a dream after he had disappeared, and in which he appeared to her in the dream. He said, "I'd like to be reborn in your family." And she said in the dream to him, "No, I don't think it's a good idea. You are an important person, a wealthy man, and we are poor peasants, so I don't think it's right." And her husband was out of town when this dream occurred, but when he returned, she told him the dream. And then he said, "Oh my," he said, "I had a dream at the same time. U Ba Kyar came to me in the dream, and he told me that he had spoken to you and you didn't want him to be reborn in our family, but I told him that it was okay." And then they had a child. And as soon as this child could speak, he began describing himself as the incarnation of this very person, Ubakyar. And the really telling thing, and this happens in many of these cases, is that this child was born with birth defects that appear to have been correlated with the death wounds of the original Ubakyar. And very often this is the case in reincarnation cases, birthmarks and physical deformations that correspond to the death wounds of the previous person. That's strong evidence.
Yeah, that's just raise the hair on your back of your neck, that kind of stuff. Do you have an idea about how it's supposed to work? You mentioned that not everyone necessarily gets reincarnated. Some do, and that sometimes, I guess, the spirit can choose what the vehicle is when they come back. Do you have some ideas on how it likely works? I know we can't know for sure, but that you could share with our listeners?
Well, one of the things that we know is that many of these young children will describe what we call the intermission period, where they're in the afterlife, in between lifetimes. Now, and their descriptions are often very similar to the accounts that we get from near-death experiencers. And typically, the spirit is surrounded by loved ones and also guides. And there's typically some consultation that goes on with the guides to determine what is an appropriate next lifetime. What are the challenges that you need to face on your spiritual journey? There seems to be some deliberate choices that are involved.
In reading about this over the years, some of the choices that are made, they choose really difficult paths forward, as if you need to make up for things you've done in some previous life or correct right or wrong of some sort, as an explanation for why mentally retarded kids are born or why kids are born with no arms and legs, that is a vehicle that's chosen by the spirit to make up for something that went wrong the last time around. Do you put much credence in that?
Well, you're referring to what people would call the law of karma.
Right.
And my sense from the literature is that it's not as if you're punished in one lifetime for the sins of a previous lifetime. It appears to be more the case that the tendencies that you have, the likes and the dislikes, the personality interests, and so on, are carried forward. The habits that you have seem to continue from one life to another, but it does seem to me that people choose the challenges that they face, and I tend to think that when you're in the afterlife and you're looking at what you need to accomplish whatever spiritual growth means for you, you're going to view it from a perspective which is very, very distant from normal human considerations. From a human perspective, nobody would want to have birth defects. Nobody would want to have abusive parents. Nobody would want to be born in a situation where there's warfare or poverty or starvation. But I think from a spiritual perspective, these things are seen very differently.
Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove is my guest. We're going to take a break now, come back and get into the issues of consciousness. We've got similarly large questions for my guest, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. For example, what is consciousness? Are we living in a simulation, for example? Can we explain, is there evidence that life goes on? We're going to get into these and more, and then in the final hour tonight, the final fourth hour, the entire hour will be devoted to questions, calls from our listeners. So put your thinking caps on, come up with some good ones for our guest, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Mishlove, in your winning essay, you include a story about a dream that happened when you were a young man. I am guessing that it sort of helped decide the path of your life because it seems to have had a profound effect. Can you tell us what the dream was and why it was significant to you?
Well, the dream occurred 50 years ago in March of 1972. And if you had known me then, George, you would have seen a graduate student in criminology at the University of California doing volunteer work at San Quentin Prison in the psychiatric unit, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. It was at that time that my Uncle Harry came to me in a dream. It was such a powerful dream. It was soul-to-soul communication beyond language completely. But when I awakened from the dream, I was crying, tears of joy, simultaneously singing one of the most sacred songs I had learned in my Jewish upbringing. And I wrote home. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." That's when I learned that he had died at that moment. And it made me realize that while I was very interested in human deviance, I no longer wished to study negative forms, psychopathology and crime. I decided then to switch to the positive forms of human deviance, meaning psychic functioning, mysticism, creativity, and intuition. And that's what led me on a search for a way to accomplish all of that eventually resulted in my creating an individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major at Berkeley in parapsychology.
What did Uncle Harry convey to you? Obviously, he said some fairly specific things, and as I recall from reading your paper, you weren't particularly close to him, right?
No, he was 50 years older than I, but I would visit him as a child. He was very close to my parents, and he ran a tiny little corner grocery store in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And as a child, a 7-year-old child, for example, I'd visit his store, and he'd walk into he had an apartment behind the grocery store, and he'd walk into the store where there was a freezer, and he'd pull out Eskimo pies for all the children, which made me think at the time that he must be a very wealthy man to have a freezer full of Eskimo pies.
Go ahead.
The content of the dream was completely beyond words. It was a very deep examination, soul to soul. I don't think I could describe it any better than that, but to say that it was totally life-changing.
Was it like a life review of your life at that point?
No, it wasn't that at all. It started out as him being very critical of my girlfriend, and it began like with a communication about how the relationships one should have with women. And as I recall, Uncle Harry had 4 wives, and he was trying to explain to me that men should dominate women, and I was trying to explain to him, no, that men and women should be equal with each other. But then things went to a completely other level. It was like a mystical experience. It was, as if I was touched by God at that moment.
I was at Cal Berkeley for a year as the debate coach. I work for their forensic team, and, it's such a great school. I could never have qualified as a student to be entered there, but I could teach for the debate program for a while, and I know how tough their academic standards are, how strict the faculty is about who gets in and what can be studied, and even though it was a fairly legendary in terms of it being a liberal school, but they have really high standards. How you were able to talk them into letting you get a degree, a PhD in parapsychology, that seems to be pretty astonishing to me. How did you do it?
Well, there were rules that the graduate division had that, first of all, if you're in a graduate program in good standing, which I was in criminology. I have a master's in Berkeley in criminology, and you want to write a doctoral dissertation on a topic that no single department is willing to sponsor, but you can find 3 faculty members from different departments who will sponsor you in your project, then you are entitled to create an individual degree. It has to be approved by the dean of the graduate division, and so I went through all of those hoops and was fortunate to find 3 professors who agreed, out of the thousands of professors at Berkeley, that this is a worthwhile area, and so I moved forward.
Let's talk about consciousness. As you know, even in the UFO field, it's become a buzzword. It is the buzzword in several different disciplines, and I think people toss it around and say it's the answer to all that we're seeking here without really understanding what it is. Can you give me sort of the state-of-the-art knowledge about consciousness? We think about, consciousness as being something universal, but also individual. Do you suppose there's one really big one, and then we each have our own little bubble of consciousness separate from that?
I like to think of it exactly that way, George, that you could call it mind at large. Some people might call it the mind of God, that we have our individual consciousnesses, which seem to be surrounded by a membrane, because for the most part, I don't have your memories and you don't have my memories. We each have our own unique conscious experiences. So you could say that our skin serves as really a metaphor for the membrane around our consciousness. But if it wasn't for this larger, we wouldn't be conscious at all, because from the point of view of material science, you can't generate consciousness out of dead matter. That's the real paradox. But consciousness basically is, what is it like to be you?
Right. And are you convinced that it isn't necessarily generated by the brain, our individual little bubble of consciousness?
Yeah, there's excellent evidence. In fact, probably most recently, because there's a resurgence of research in psychedelic drugs, one of the things we're learning is that the rich conscious experiences that people have on psychedelics, where everything seems more meaningful, seems to occur when the brain is actually shutting down. Researchers thought, no, it should be the opposite. The brain should be lighting up like a Christmas tree during psychedelic drug experiences, but it's just the opposite. And that suggests that the brain acts more as a filter for this higher consciousness that we all have access to. But when the filter stops working, then we open up to a larger consciousness, including contact with the afterlife.
Meaning we join the bigger picture.
Yes.
What do you think about, so I posted an article on our website tonight for coast-to-coast listeners and visitors that site about this idea that the universe has a mind. You were talking about the mind of God, but do you think it is legitimate to consider the universe as an entity, as a living, thinking entity itself?
I said as much in my essay. Yes, the universe is conscious.
How do you reconcile that with arguments that have been made by a lot of really smart people, academics, that reality isn't real, that we're living in a simulated reality?
That's a very fascinating argument. I think it is worth paying close attention to. If you take it too literally, it almost seems as if we're in a video game of some kind, and that there are programmers outside the game who are playing games with us. And I don't think that that's the case. I don't think it's like we're in some sort of a giant computer controlled by aliens from a distant galaxy. I wouldn't go that far with the idea, but it does seem to me to suggest more that this four-dimensional space-time reality that we exist in is embedded within a higher dimensional space. And that higher dimensional space is embedded within an even higher dimensional space. And there's probably an infinite progression of spaces nested within each other until you get all the way out to infinity.
Like those Russian dolls you're describing there.
Yeah.
It sure seems like reality isn't all that real sometimes. It feels scripted. It goes to the heart of, do we really have free will? If some alien teenager is playing games, creating some simulation to see what those crazy earthlings will do next, it is an appealing scenario to a lot of folks who, I don't know if they want to just be contrarians or what, but it really makes people think. I know that.
It does make you think, and I'll admit there are many times when I think to myself, this does feel like it's scripted. And the irony is, I suspect it's us who are at a different level. You might say the level of our own higher self. We're the ones, I think, who are writing the script.
There are some fairly ambitious descriptions and definitions of consciousness, the universal consciousness, and some people include, inanimate objects, matter. Certainly include plants and animals. Really some interesting research about plants being sentient to some degree. Where are you on that one?
Well, I tend to lean toward what is known in philosophy as idealism, which is to suggest that the entire universe is essentially mental in nature, that we are embedded in consciousness, and things that appear to be physical, like rocks and mountains and so on, exist because of consciousness, because we're conscious of them. And otherwise, physicists would tell you it's mostly all empty space.
Yeah. I mean, our senses are limited. We can only see so much. We can't see things that dogs can see or hear. And you read about reality, and it's pretty clear that there are really smart people who recognize that what we see isn't really what reality looks like, right? I mean, I'm sitting on a chair here now that's just atoms, and as you said, a lot of space in between them. But I think it's a chair that's solid.
Yeah. That's what our consciousness provides for us, and of course, it's mediated through the sensory system, through our retina, our nerves, and so on. But even our nerves are, one might say, the product of consciousness. I'm more inclined to think that rather than that the brain creates consciousness, that consciousness creates the brain. Or as one philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup, whom I've interviewed, would say that it's the external appearance of consciousness.
I'd like to get into, maybe we'll save this for the next hour, but about communication with the dead, and there's a way to build a spirit phone, that sort of a thing. Before we get that, maybe the IONS folks who will be looking and discussing near-death experiences, do you sense a change? I don't know if you necessarily attribute it to the Bigelow funding and the ideas that are coming, a sense that it is more acceptable, respectable for academics to go ahead and pursue, for example, near-death experiences or the pursuit of consciousness and whether it survives physical death now?
Well, when I first started my studies in parapsychology, there was no such thing as the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and now there is. It's been in existence for well over 20 years. So, and we know, for example, that over 1 million people have had this near-death experience. It's very widely reported. So yes, I think it's a growing area of interest, and bit by bit it is achieving acceptance, particularly within the medical profession.
Are there types of research, avenues that you could pursue if you had unlimited resources, or at least sufficient resources, that you feel would be successful in proving it one way or another?
Well, I favor the idea of what I call psychonauts, sort of the equivalent of astronauts, that people who are skilled in near-death experiences or in the use of psychedelic drugs or in meditation or hypnosis or lucid dreaming are able to consciously explore the depths of consciousness, including the afterlife, and begin to map it out. I think that what we're doing today in this regard is very similar to what took place in the 15th century when explorers like Columbus and others were looking at the New World and mapping out whole new continents. And we're doing that now, only we're mapping continents of the mind.
Are you concerned that governments might be taking over that kind of research? We know that this kind of investigation has gone on behind the scenes for a long time. Remote viewing, for example, developed by, the CIA. Are you worried that that could be captured, that kind of research?
I don't think that governments can capture it. I think that this is all out in the public now, and it's available to the public. Governments may have their own projects. I suspect that they do. Corporations also have their own projects that we may not learn about. I favor open science, but if people want to approach it in closed private groups, it's understandable that they would do so because there's such a stigma still in our society that privacy would be essential for those people.
We're talking with Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove about a wide-ranging array of topics coming up. Hungry ghosts, angry spirits, deception from the other side, the dangers of trying to communicate with spirits, with whatever the world is like on the other side, assuming that it exists. A lot more to come here on Coast to Coast. And as I said, in the fourth hour tonight, we'll be opening up the phone lines to get your calls and questions and comments.